Two people who ran the opposition campaigns in the 2021 election have been listening in. They're ready to respond. Fred Deslauriers was the 2021 Conservative National Campaign Manager. He's a managing partner with Deslauriers Public Affairs. And Anne McGrath is the NDP's National Director. Hi to both of you. Thank you very much for making the time. Mr. Deslauriers, I'll start with you. You heard the minister there essentially, and I'll sort of summarize what he said. Look, this report underscores what the Prime Minister has been saying, which is that the overall outcome of the election was not compromised. That puts the issue to bed. We're working hard on this. We take it seriously. Does it put the issue to bed for you?
Certainly not. This is a concerning issue that we've seen. We saw this happening during the election. We raised this concern with officials. We've got even more reports after the election was done. This report does nothing. It's, one of the recommendations is basically a year after the next election, they'll tell us what they're going to do to safeguard. That's not enough. We've identified some serious legislative gaps. We had a Conservative member of Parliament pushing for a foreign agent registry. Other countries have this, that we can do this, that we can actually put some teeth to this and go after these people that are doing this.
Can I just follow up before I go to Ms. McGrath and ask you a little bit, if you could shed, I feel like in the past few weeks, a lot of Canadians have learned for the first time that some of these committees or groups were struck to determine whether or not there was foreign election interference. What is the nature of the campaign's involvement with that committee? Like, how much information was flowing back and forth throughout the campaign so that this group of people or CSIS or whomever knew the full scope of potential foreign election interference?
Right. So it was really a one-way street during the whole process. So before the campaign, during and after, there was a mechanism for us, for the parties, to meet with the task force. They would brief us on certain security issues, but when it came to actual political interference, there was nothing coming to us. There was absolutely nothing. They weren't alarming us to anything. They weren't making us aware. We were making them aware of things that we were seeing on the ground from our local campaigns. And afterwards, we did give them a fulsome report on the interference that we saw.
Ms. McGrath, what about you? I'll start off on the same question, and just sort of, if you could describe for Canadians listening what your interactions were like with this group or with CSIS or sort of on the issue of foreign interference during the campaign.
Well, let me start by saying that I don't take issue with the idea that the outcome of the election, is legitimate and all of that. But I don't think that you can use that assertion that I don't think anyone is actually even taking issue with to say that we don't need to look at this seriously. And so I think that's the important thing here, is that just because the outcome might not have been seriously altered doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about the fact that there are foreign actors attempting to interfere in our election process. So I think that there is a need for more information on this. The task force itself and the meetings with the political parties, I would agree, were a bit of a one-way street for sure. My sense was that they were and I think that the report even refers to that, they were a bit of at least in 2021, which is the one I was involved in, they were an afterthought. They didn't start till really start until a few weeks into the campaign. They were a little bit pro forma and very vague. And the political parties that were there did ask questions about how would we know if this was happening? What would be the things that we should look for? What should we do if we think it's all of those kinds of things? And there wasn't a lot of information on that. I did find that there was, there was some good information shared about, what they referred to as politically motivated violent extremists and all of those kinds of things. But in terms of foreign interference, I think people were concerned about exactly that. How do you know? What do you look for? What do you do if you think that it's an issue? Will we be informed if you think it's an issue? All of those kinds of things. And there wasn't a lot of information on those kinds of things. So I think that, the report talks about sort of in between elections and earlier and more that kind of thing. And I do agree with that.
So let me just follow up with you quickly, Ms. McGrath, and ask, were you surprised as you read in the past few weeks about the allegations of interference in, particularly as they related to Conservative candidates, for example, or even some Liberal candidates, and the nature of what CSIS is saying, foreign actors were doing?
I was surprised. I was alarmed. I was concerned. I feel like we need to know more. I feel like the Canadian public has a right to know more. I don't think that I'm not surprised that there are foreign actors attempting to interfere in our elections, and you know that's not a particular surprise. But I'm surprised that there was information about it, or that there might have been information about it that that hasn't been acted on, or that hasn't been followed up on, or that has been hidden. I think, and that's why I think a public inquiry is probably the way to go. I think we need to find a mechanism for making sure that we get to the bottom of it, really. And I don't think that the procedure in the House Affairs Committee, PROC as it's called, I don't think that's the appropriate place to do that. I don't think that you know, my experience with these kinds of things, and I think everybody's experience with these kind of parliamentary committee investigations, is that when it's something as kind of volatile as this, it can turn into a bit of a circus, you know, with filibustering and weird motions and all of that kind of thing. So I just don't think that's where we're going to find out what happened.
The issue also, Mr. Delory, with the committee is that, and tomorrow that committee is expected to hear, for example, from people who have, you know, access to the highest level of intelligence on this, from CSIS, from the RCMP, the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. They don't say a lot during these committees because they can't really. Right. And so I wonder from your perspective if another venue, I don't know if it's an inquiry, I don't know what the exact venue is, but if a venue where more information could be shared, in your view, is necessary based on what we know so far.
100%. Look, I don't think I'm quite sure the Liberals were not behind this or involved in this. They may have benefited from it. They're the governing party. The NDP and the Conservatives, we should all sit down and figure out what this problem is and how we solve it together. Other countries have systems in place to combat this, and there's other ways to do this. I think we need better legislation. An inquiry, I don't know what we're going to get out of that. I don't know how long that's going to take. I think there's solutions in front of us if we look at what other countries are doing to combat it and have a bipartisan approach to figuring this problem out and getting to the bottom of it and putting solutions in front of us.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Mr. Delory, Ms. McGrath, thank you very much, both of you, for your time. Fred Delory and Anne McGrath.